The sharp end of the evolutionary spear, so to speak, is adaptation. Adaptation means being able to garner the energy and matter needed to persist and reproduce, and to garner them from a turbulent and unpredictable environment. Modern Darwinism, or more properly gene selectionism, is bereft of a coherent theory of adaptation, and this makes modern Darwinism an incoherent theory of evolution. There's no secret about this. Over the decades, enormous effort and ingenuity has been directed at resolving this problem. I've covered many of these efforts in this series, and all have failed to resolve the problem. Here I turn our attention to another effort centered around a concept known as the niche, an enormously sophisticated, and I have to say beautiful body of theory has built up around this idea. Yet it suffers from the same problem that plagues most of modern Darwinism. It's an empty tautology built around a flawed conception of life and the living environment. As it was originally conceived, the niche was intended to express an organism's place in nature. The inspiration came right out of the natural theology of William Paley and the 18th century Parson naturalists like Gilbert White. To both Paley and White, the extraordinary diversity of living things and their harmonious relations with one another were a reflection of the power and wisdom of the Creator, that famous argument from design. And the niche concept was an expression of this. Every living thing occupied its rightful place in nature, its niche. Cactus wrens, for example, live on and around cacti. The cactus plant is the cactus wren's niche. Cacti are where cactus wrens belong, their rightful place. Along the same lines, flamingos filter sediments in shallow estuaries. This is the flamingo's niche. Go to a tropical estuary and you're likely to find flamingos. Tropical estuaries is where flamingos belong, their rightful place. It simply made no sense to suppose that a cactus wren or flamingo could occupy something other than its rightful place, that cactus wrens could filter estuarine sediments, or that flamingos could eat cactus fruits. Absurd. Every living thing has its rightful place in nature, and the niche is the good fit between the organism and its environment. As endless nature documentaries might describe it, each organism is wonderfully adapted to its environment. Darwin challenged all that, but as we've seen, he actually stumbled badly over the problem of adaptation. And that was the crisis of Darwinism. When the Darwinian idea was resuscitated in the early 20th century, this brought a new gloss to the niche concept. Now, the niche was something that could be competed for. Organisms occupied particular niches, not because the Creator God had put them there, but because the occupant had outcompeted other organisms that were not so well equipped to occupy them. Let's take that classic example, Darwin's finches. The different islands of the Galapagos archipelago are occupied by characteristic species of finch that differ primarily in the shapes of their bills. These range from very heavy bills to quite slender needle-like bills. At the time Darwin visited the archipelago and collected these finches, this diversity of form didn't impress him very much. Mostly, he thought it was an interesting curiosity. And it was not until later that the Galapagos finches became one of Darwin's principal arguments against the notion that species arise in so-called centers of creation. How, he asked, could each island be a distinct center of creation? That stretched credulity. To Darwin, the more likely explanation was that a common finch from the South American mainland had migrated to the islands, maybe blown there by winds. Once there, the finches on the different islands had evolved to fit the unique circumstance of each island. So the very thick-billed finches evolved towards eating seeds with heavy coats that needed a nutcracker to get into them. The finches with intermediate-sized nutcracker bills fed on smaller seeds. The more slender-billed finches evolved to dig into fleshy cactus fruits and extract the juicy seeds. And finally, the finches with the more pincer-shaped bills evolved towards digging into plants and extracting insects. In short, the Galapagos finches evolved to fill various niches that prior to their arrival had gone unoccupied. The heavy seed eater's niche, the small seed eater's niche, the fleshy seed eater's niche, and the insect eater's niche. Darwin's explanation for the Galapagos finches had a bit of an ad hoc quality to it, similar, in fact, to the centers of creation argument. Thinking like this was one of the reasons Darwinism got into trouble around the turn of the 20th century. As we've seen, Darwinism got a shot in the arm in the 1920s with the genetic theory of natural selection. This recast evolution not as adaptation, but as change of gene representation in populations over time. One of the founders of the genetic theory was this man, Sewall Wright, who took a novel approach to the question of the niche. The genetic theory of natural selection was built around the population genetics of single genes, and Wright wanted to extend this idea to multiple genes. Out of this, he conceived a powerful metaphor known as the adaptive landscape. It's easiest to understand adaptive landscapes graphically. Suppose we have some trait that varies continuously. Let's just say, for argument's sake, that the trait is color of an animal's coat. It should be possible to construct a plot of fitness versus variation in this trait. At some value of that trait, fitness will be maximized, and this high point is a so-called adaptive peak. Natural selection should therefore act to drive variance in a population toward that adaptive peak. Okay, that's easy enough, if a little trivial. Wright went beyond this simplicity, however, which is where the metaphor of the adaptive peak takes on a certain beauty. One could imagine, for example, that there could be two genetic variants where fitness is high. That is to say, there could be two adaptive peaks. Selection should therefore drive populations towards one or the other of these adaptive peaks and away from what we might call an adaptive trough. Two gene variants would therefore come to be represented in the population. This is really just a graphical way to express fitness for a single gene, what Wright, along with Fisher and Haldane, had already covered. So Wright expanded his analysis beyond single genes to how multiple interacting genes can determine fitness. We can see this by extending the graphical metaphor of the adaptive peak. So we have our graph of trait variation versus fitness. Let's designate this as trait A, and the simple graph represents variation of a single trait. Now let's add an additional trait specified by another gene. We can represent this with a new axis for the new trait, trait B. Along this new axis will be variation of fitness for trait B alone. Let's give it two adaptive peaks. There's now a horizontal plane between the axes for trait A and trait B, and mapping the separate fitness functions for both traits onto this plane gives us a two-dimensional fitness landscape. And adaptive peaks will map out onto this fitness landscape. If we look down directly on the plane, it will look like a kind of weather map, with longitude and latitude respectively represented by traits A and B. The variation of fitness for the two genes in combination can now be represented as gradations in color, from peaks of high fitness, grading into intermediate fitness levels, and down to troughs of low fitness, arrayed along these two dimensions. Like on a weather map, we can lay out contour lines representing levels of equivalent fitness. Populations would then evolve from regions of low fitness towards regions of intermediate fitness, and then eventually coalesce at regions of high fitness, toward the adaptive peaks of the two-dimensional fitness landscape, in other words. The mathematical appeal of Wright's approach was that it could be extended to an indefinite number of dimensions and genes. One could build fitness spaces for 3 traits, for example, or for 4 traits, or for any number of traits acting together. For all its mathematical sophistication, however, Wright's concept of the adaptive landscape suffered from the same tautological problem that the genetic theory of natural selection did. High fitness came from selection of genes for high fitness, and genes for high fitness were defined by the high fitness they conferred. Nevertheless, Wright's adaptive landscape was the inspiration for this man, G. Evelyn Hutchinson, to construct a new and very powerful theory of the niche. Hutchinson was perhaps the most influential ecologist of the 20th century, and he can properly be credited with inventing modern ecology. His family tree of students and postdocs represents a who's who of 20th century ecology. Hutchinson's conception of the niche was similar in approach to Wright's adaptive landscape, but Hutchinson focused more directly on the biology of adaptation. As before, we start with a plot of fitness. In this graph, it's fitness versus some property of the environment, temperature, for example. Depending upon the environmental temperature, fitness may either be very low or very high, and this is just another way of saying that some temperatures are tolerated better than others, that an organism is better adapted to some temperatures than others. The span of temperatures where fitness is high constitutes the organism's thermal niche. The beauty of Hutchinson's conception was that it could be measured using actual creatures. We'll see how momentarily, but until then, let's get back to the theory. Because we're dealing with just one environmental property, temperature in this case, we can call this a one-dimensional niche. Just as we could do with Wright's conception, we can expand Hutchinson's definition of the niche to multiple dimensions. In addition to the dimension of environmental temperature, we might, for example, plot environmental pH as an independent variable, a second dimension. Certain ranges of pH will confer high fitness on the animal, whereas others might not. As we did with Wright's adaptive landscape, we can now map out a niche in two environmental dimensions. Specifically, there should be a zone of high fitness, what we might call a thermal pH niche, which can be mapped onto the fitness plane. Like Wright's conception of the adaptive space, Hutchinson's niche can be expanded to any of a number of different dimensions of environmental variation: temperature, pH, sunlight, wind. I could go on and on, but each dimension will have its own fitness function associated with it, and there's no theoretical reason why one cannot talk about a three-dimensional niche, a four-dimensional niche, a 10-dimensional niche, or even an n-dimensional niche. All these fitness functions can be combined into the organism's niche. The most important thing about the Hutchinsonian niche, though, is that it offers a level of empirical test that Sewall Wright's conception of the niche could not. You can measure the Hutchinsonian niche. It's hard to measure Wright's adaptive landscape. Let's take the thermal niche as an example. This particular example is taken from lizards. Being ectotherms, lizards' body temperatures vary widely, tracking the environmental temperature closely. Now, rather than fitness being plotted on the y-axis, we can measure some quantifiable correlate of fitness, in this case running speed. The connection of running speed to fitness is pretty straightforward. To compete for resources and mates, a lizard has to be able to move around its habitat. And the faster it can do so, the more likely it is to garner the resources and mates it needs for reproduction. Running speed at different temperatures can be measured. You put the lizard in an arena, give it a goose, and measure how fast it runs away. And you do this at different body temperatures, and you compile data for running speed versus temperature, to which you can fit a best fit curve. This result makes sense. Lizards that are too hot or too cold are unable to move around very fast. And there will be some body temperature at which running speed is maximized. This is something every lizard-catching boy knows. But we scientists can use our data to quantify the thermal niche. Specifically, we can define it as some range of temperatures over which running speed is within some proximity to the maximum, let's say 90%. If we measure the range of environmental temperatures in the environment in which the lizard lives, we see that there's a pretty good correspondence between the thermal niche, as measured by running speed, and the likelihood of favorable temperatures existing in the lizard's habitat. So it's a reasonable inference that lizards inhabiting this thermal environment will evolve to conform their physiology to the most frequent temperatures the lizard is likely to encounter. There's still a certain, shall we say, tautological quality to the Hutchinsonian niche. Is there any way out of this logical trap? This is where we come back to that original conception of the niche as an organism's rightful place in nature. It's really a philosophical issue. The niche concept originated from a Platonic philosophical tradition. The niche was a reflection of an ideal conception of organisms and nature. The niche, in short, is an expression of natural theology. Despite its attempts to put natural theology at some distance, the niche concept has never quite shaken these Platonic roots. And this makes the niche concept prone to a kind of crypto-Platonism, Platonism masquerading as something else. Here's how that works. Imagine there's a niche for birds that eat seeds with strong coats. There is an ideal seed eater which has all the attributes needed to eat such seeds, and these include a heavy beak, a reinforced skull, and other adaptations. For the Galapagos finches, evolution from the ancestral South American finch involved a kind of striving towards the heavy seed eater niche, and this is a very Platonic idea. Okay, there's that. Another problem with the niche concept is a tendency towards bad habits of thinking. We might call this ad hoc niche proliferation, and here's how that works. Lots of animals eat insects. These are called insectivores. They fill what we might call an insectivore niche. Animals evolve to fill the insectivore niche, even if they stem from different ancestries. So you can have mammalian insectivores, for example, and avian insectivores. Each lineage evolves in its own way to fill that insectivore niche. Now here's a problem. Lots of insects can fly, which enables them to evade the depredations of insectivores which cannot fly, like those mammalian insectivores. And even among avian insectivores, these might prefer to feed on insect prey that don't fly. Flight is expensive. It's just easier to pick insects that don't fly. Still, insectivores have to eat, and by taking to the sky, flying insects have moved a considerable resource to the air, voting with their wings, so to speak. And this is a resource that hungry insectivores could tap. They could fill an aerial insectivore niche that stands empty and waiting to be filled. This is how we can explain the evolution of both mammals and birds to fill that niche. Bats in the case of mammalian insectivores, and birds like swifts and swallows that specialize in catching insects on the fly. But there's a little problem. Both bats and swifts are competing to occupy the aerial insectivore niche. Competition to occupy the aerial insectivore niche is resolved by creating two new niches. Bats have evolved to occupy one of these new niches, namely the nocturnal aerial insectivore niche. Swifts and swallows, for their parts, have evolved to fill a new diurnal aerial insectivore niche. You can see how ad hoc niche proliferation can creep in. Each diverse habit of being an insectivore is explained by positing a new niche for lineages to fill by evolving into them. In short, the niche concept has a tendency to fall into the same trap that essential vitalism did in the 18th and 19th centuries. An endless proliferation of ad hoc essences to explain the diverse attributes of living organisms, and an endless proliferation of ad hoc niches to explain the diverse ways of making a living. Nevertheless, the niche concept is such a powerful idea that evolutionists have persisted in trying to refine it. The latest refinement, called niche construction theory, draws inspiration from one of the many metaphors for the Darwinian idea, the environment as a so-called selective filter. We can paraphrase this idea as the organism proposes and the environment disposes, and here's how that supposedly works. Reproduction with any generation represents an experiment in combining genes to produce a variety of different phenotypes. We can represent these as spheres with different sizes and colors. That's the organism proposing. Each different phenotype represents a proposal to pass genes on to the next generation, X plus 1. Natural selection acts as a so-called selective filter through which the different phenotypes must pass to make it into the next generation, and that's the disposition. In our example, both the green spheres and the blue spheres can pass unimpeded through the selective filter. These phenotypes are selected for. They are well adapted to the environment in which they live. However, the red sphere is too large to pass through the filter, and this phenotype is selected against. It's poorly adapted to the environment. The selective filter metaphor presumes that organisms are at the mercy of their environment. They are either well adapted or they are not. However, what if the different phenotypes could fiddle with the selective filter? Suppose, for example, that the phenotype represented by the red sphere could pry apart the meshwork of the selective filter. By manipulating the environment in this way, the red sphere phenotype is actually controlling its selective environment. This phenomenon is known as the Baldwin effect. The Baldwin effect is the starting point for niche construction theory. Niche construction theory claims to be a fundamental challenge to what its proponents call standard evolutionary theory, or SET. SET is essentially neo-Darwinian dogma, and we're all familiar with it. A flow diagram will highlight how niche construction differs from SET. We follow changes through time, which corresponds to changes in progression through generations. There exists an environment, which we're depicting as this green space that persists through time. We're expressing this as a single color from the environment at time t to the environment at some later time. Natural selection will favor a particular genotype, which will produce a phenotype of particular form and function. We'll symbolize this phenotype with a pentagon shape. The next generation is the result of genetic inheritance from the previous generation. Because genetic inheritance is conservative, this genotype will be identical to the previous generations. Natural selection will act upon that genotype. If the environment stays the same, the next generation's phenotype will be the same as in previous generations. But if the environment changes, which we're expressing here as a change of color over time, natural selection will act upon the genotype, which will produce a new phenotype, which we'll represent as a hexagon. Okay, that's standard evolutionary theory. Take a few minutes to work through this flow diagram if you need to, because it will help to understand how niche construction theory differs from SET. Let's lay that out in a new flow diagram. We have the same timeline and environment with natural selection acting on a genotype to specify a phenotype. Note that we are color-coding natural selection with red arrows. The genotype in one generation will be passed on through genetic inheritance to the next generation, and natural selection will act on that. If the environment changes, natural selection will act on the genotype to produce a new phenotype. So far, this is standard evolutionary theory. Niche construction theory asserts that the genotype can include modification of the environment by an organism. The Baldwin effect, in other words, and we'll symbolize that with color-coded green arrows. This introduces an alternate form of heredity, which we might call ecological inheritance. Ecological inheritance, like genetic inheritance, is a conservative influence. It will act to resist natural changes in the environment. When this new inherited environment acts upon the genotype of subsequent generations, it will conserve the genotype and the specified phenotype. In other words, the genotypes are constructing the environment for the benefit of the genotypes that can implement the Baldwin effect most effectively. Niche construction theory also introduces a new dimension in the form of culture, which we're symbolizing here in orange. Culture changes through time, and natural selection can act through the phenotype. If culture changes, this may influence the fate of future generations of phenotypes. But niche construction theory treats culture itself as a kind of constructed niche. As such, there's a kind of cultural inheritance that will ensure the continuity of genotypes and future phenotypes. Niche construction looks like an advance over standard neo-Darwinism, and that's certainly how its proponents depict it, and with some justification. Niche construction theory opens the doors to such innovative notions as ecological and cultural inheritance, and this lets in previously forbidden ideas like Lamarckianism. Cultural inheritance, for example, is basically a Lamarckian idea. A culture, like language or reading, certainly is something that's acquired, and if it affects evolutionary history, this counts as Lamarckian evolution. Darwinism claims to be against Lamarckianism, so there's a fundamental challenge right there. Ecological inheritance is another novel concept deriving from niche construction. The notion that organisms can control their own selection doesn't really sit comfortably in the Darwinian idea. For all that, though, niche construction theory has really not strayed very far off the neo-Darwinist reservation. The theory is still predicated, for example, on the notion that the gene is central to the evolutionary process. Environmental modification, for example, is ultimately cast in terms of a genetically determined capability to modify environments. And the same goes for culture, which can be reduced to the inheritance, mutation, proliferation, and selection of memes, memory particles, which basically are mental genes. And this gets us right back to those tautological flaws that have always plagued the Darwinian idea. So, what's the alternative? The extended organism idea has many parallels to niche construction, including the notion of a reciprocal adaptation of organism and environment. That organisms not only adapt to environments, but adapt environments to themselves. Nevertheless, the extended organism idea differs from niche construction theory in some significant ways. No surprise there, the extended organism idea comes from a very different philosophical tradition, an Aristotelian rather than a Platonic tradition. Niche construction theory is still beholden to the object memory concept, whether the memory token be the particular gene, meme, or whatever. The extended organism idea, in contrast, is process-based, not object-based, and this allows us to fold both hereditary memory and adaptation under a single, dynamic, interactive, and participatory conception of organism, life, heredity, and evolution. How? Well, we can still have a phenotype, which can be specified to a degree by a genotype, but the organism itself is embedded in an environment via an adaptive boundary, which can modify the environment. This could be considered a type of niche construction, the organism modifying its environment in a genetically specified way, but the extended organism idea brings a different interpretation. Modification of the environment can be expressed in terms of the mobilization of matter and energy, so that the extended organism, phenotype, environment, and adaptive boundaries can persist through time. Fitness is determined by the persistence of this whole arrangement through time. Persistence, for its part, is an expression of that fundamental property of life, namely homeostasis. Homeostasis works through cognition, which draws the extended organism forward through time to persist. What's driving the evolutionary process forward, therefore, is cognition and cognition's flip side, intentionality. Intention-driven persistence then draws the genotype along with it through epigenetic modification and definition of new expressions of hereditary memory in all its forms. In short, it's intention that's driving evolution forward, always seeking novel ways to persist. The genes, whatever they are the lagging indicators of evolution, not its drivers. In short, evolution is a cognitive, intentional process, precisely the opposite of the Darwinian selection-based process.